Have you ever seen a clown try to outwit a royal guard? Well, buckle up because this is a showdown you won't want to miss. Drop a comment below and let me know. Where are you watching from? Are you ready for some laughs or just here to see who wins this ultimate prank? Let's dive in. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the royal palace. The majestic stone walls shimmered under the sunlight, while the well-groomed royal guards stood stoically at attention, their uniforms crisp and sharp. Each guard stood perfectly still, eyes forward, rifles resting on their shoulders, silent, imposing figures who embodied military discipline. The usual hum of excitement buzzed through the crowd of tourists who gathered in front of the gates. Cameras flashed as people snapped pictures of the iconic palace. Laughter and chatter filled the air as the crowd admired the ceremonial guards. But among the sea of fascinated faces and smartphones, there was one person who stood out like a neon sign in a blackout. Boinko. Boinko was a clown, his face painted with a bright red nose, wide cheeks, and a colorful suit that could blind you from a mile away. His oversized shoes squeaked loudly with every step, and his hair, an unruly mess of orange curls, bounced as he skipped along the cobblestones with exaggerated energy. His mischievous grin spread from ear to ear, and his eyes twinkled with the anticipation of a grand prank. His mission? To prank one of the royal guards, of course. Boinko weaved through the crowd, dancing to a tune only he could hear, his hands flailing in exaggerated gestures as he tried to gain the attention of those around him. His feet barely touched the ground as he skipped, practically bouncing on the balls of his feet, looking for the perfect target. And there it was. One of the royal guards, tall, immaculate, with a rifle casually resting over his shoulder, stood near the gates, completely motionless. His uniform was flawless, not a single wrinkle to be seen, and his expression was one of absolute concentration. The challenge was obvious. He was exactly the kind of person who needed to be pranked. With dramatic flair, Boinko straightened up, took a deep breath, and strutted toward the guard. Each step was slow and exaggerated, as if the clown were preparing for something theatrical. He approached the guard as if about to engage in a battle of wits or physical prowess, though only one side was prepared for the duel. Boinko cleared his throat with a theatrical cough before addressing the guard. "Hello, Mr. Guard. How's the weather in your world of silence?" Boinko quipped, throwing his hands up in the air with an exaggerated flourish. No response. The guard didn't budge, not even a twitch in his posture. Boinko smiled to himself, unfazed. Okay, I see how it is," he muttered. Then, in a move that was pure comedy, Boinko whipped out a rubber chicken from his pocket and held it out in front of the guard, as though he were presenting a priceless treasure. "Surely, this will break the ice, right?" he said, wiggling the chicken in front of the guard's face. A few giggles escaped from the crowd as Boinko swung the rubber chicken from side to side, hoping for a laugh, or at least a raised eyebrow, from the stoic figure. But still, the guard stood motionless. The only thing that moved was the breeze gently rustling his uniform. The crowd started to catch on to the hilarity of the situation. Some tourists began to snicker. Others pulled out their phones, eager to record the scene for social media. "Well, I guess you really like your job, huh?" Boinko continued, inching closer, his antics growing more outrageous. "No time for jokes? No room for a little fun?" The crowd laughed harder, some even clapped in encouragement, but the guard remained completely unfazed. Boinko, undeterred, decided to take his act up a notch. He took a step back, puffed out his chest, and began mimicking the guard's stance. He clasped his hands behind his back and stood as rigidly as he could, trying to match the perfect stillness of the royal guard. His face was full of concentration, as if he were determined to outdo the soldier in a contest of absolute stoicism. But of course, he couldn't hold it. The clown's muscles began to twitch from the effort, and his feet shuffled in place, struggling to maintain the perfection of the guard's posture. His hands slipped, forcing him to readjust, but the audience was loving it. "Nice job, sir," Boinko finally called out, straightening up with a victorious grin. "You've got the stillness of a rock, but I bet I can be just as serious." He winked at the guard, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Straightening his back, he struck a pose as if to prove his point. And yet, the guard's eyes didn't move. His posture didn't budge. His face remained as smooth and unreadable as stone, The crowd was in stitches, laughing, some even gasping in disbelief. How could the guard not break? Boinko had given it everything: rubber chickens, goofy faces, exaggerated poses, but still, nothing. Boinko took a deep breath, feeling his resolve harden. Okay, okay, I see how this is going to be, he muttered to himself, determined not to give up so easily. It's going to take a lot more than that to crack you, huh? With the crowd still watching and anticipation growing, Boinko began plotting his next move. If this guard thought he could resist a real challenge, he was sorely mistaken. Undeterred by the complete lack of reaction from the royal guard, Boinko felt a rush of confidence. He had expected some resistance, but the guard's unmoving nature was almost too perfect. This was a challenge, and Boinko loved a challenge. The more the guard stood there like a statue, the more determined the clown became. He grinned widely to himself. This was going to be easier than he thought. With a playful chuckle, Boinko suddenly dropped into a deep squat, his knees creaking with exaggerated effort as he lowered himself to the ground. His arms shot out at odd angles like a wind-up toy, making exaggerated, slow movements as though he were preparing for a wild dance battle with an invisible partner. The crowd watched, their curiosity piqued. "I bet I can outstand you," he declared loudly, popping up into the air like a jittery kangaroo on a trampoline. His shoes flapped loudly with every jump, a comical sound that only added to the ridiculousness of the moment. He spun in midair, made wild faces, and flailed his arms in every direction. "Look at me! I'm an unstoppable force of nature!" Boinko yelled, as if he were the king of an imaginary jungle. The tourists couldn't contain themselves. Laughter erupted across the crowd. Some even gasped in delight, pulling out their phones to record the absurd spectacle. Boinko felt the energy of the crowd feeding him, egging him on. He was winning them over. Surely this would be the moment the guard broke. Just a little twitch, a shift of the eyes. But no. The guard remained motionless, his face as unyielding as the palace walls behind him. Not a single muscle shifted. Boinko, growing bolder, took another leap and landed with a comically loud thud. He immediately sprang back up and began bouncing in place, his oversized shoes making loud slap, slap sounds on the cobblestone. With each hop, he exaggerated the motion even more, pretending like each jump was a massive effort, as though he were performing acrobatics worthy of the circus. "Seriously, you've got to feel this energy," he laughed to the crowd, tossing in a ridiculous spin for good measure. The crowd was loving it, but there was no sign of a crack from the guard. "Oh, come on," Boinko pouted, hopping back and forth like a child begging for a treat. "Just a little giggle?" he said, turning to face the guard with an exaggerated pout and a hopeful expression. Boinko then attempted a grand move, an exaggerated pirouette, spinning on one foot with all the grace of a windmill caught in a tornado. His arms flung wide, nearly knocking a nearby tourist's hat off as he spun. His goofy grin stretched across his painted face, and his eyes locked onto the guard's stone expression. "See? You can do this too. Just let go," Boinko shouted, now fully embracing the ridiculousness of the moment. And still, nothing. The crowd was howling with laughter, sensing the clown's desperation. Every wild move Boinko made only highlighted how utterly composed the guard remained. For a split second, Boinko's face froze. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. The guard was a wall, unbreakable. And Boinko, he was a clown, throwing everything he had at a force that was resolutely still. But there was no turning back now. The crowd was watching, the tension was rising. They expected more. Feeling the weight of their eyes on him, Boinko's sense of competition surged to new heights. There was only one thing left to do: escalate. The clown puffed out his chest, without squaring his shoulders with theatrical precision, like an actor preparing for his grandest performance. He could see that the guard wasn't going to be swayed by silly dances or ridiculous facial expressions. He needed something bigger, something bolder. He looked around for inspiration, and there it was. Boinko's eyes gleamed mischievously as he spotted a nearby tourist stand filled with inexpensive hats, one of which was comically oversized. He couldn't help himself. He darted over, snatching up the first hat he could find, a huge floppy royal guard hat that was clearly too big for him, even if he were an actual giant. With a dramatic sweeping motion, Boinko plopped the oversized hat onto his head. The hat hung far over his eyes, blocking his view, but Boinko didn't care. He was a man on a mission. He struck a ridiculous royal pose, shoulders back, chest out, and marched back to the guard, each step exaggerated as though he were royalty. "Behold," Boinko cried, looking up from under the brim of the hat, "I have come to join the ranks of the greatest. I, too, shall guard the palace." He saluted the guard, though it looked more like an awkward attempt to scratch his ear, given the hat's comical size. A few tourists burst into giggles, while others quickly grabbed their cameras to capture the moment. But once again, the guard remained unmoved, silent, stoic, unyielding. Boinko took one more look at the crowd, then back at the motionless royal figure. He took a deep breath. "All right, Mr. Guard," Boinko muttered to himself. "You want serious? Let's see how serious we can get." Boinko paused for a moment, wiping his brow, his face a mix of determination and playful frustration. The guard was not budging, not even the slightest flicker in his eyes. The clown had already thrown everything at him: silly dances, goofy faces, oversized hats, and even a royal salute. But the guard? Utterly unfazed. It was time for something bigger. This was it. The grand finale. Boinko took a deep breath. He was ready for the big guns. As he glanced around, surveying the crowd for new props, his eyes locked onto a nearby tourist cart. There they were, a collection of brightly colored plastic hats and tacky souvenirs. His heart raced. He knew exactly what he needed. With a mischievous grin, Boinko waddled over to the cart, his large shoes making comical slapping sounds on the pavement. He reached for the biggest, most ridiculous royal guard hat on display, one so oversized it looked like a novelty item. It was 3 times too big for his head, the hat barely sitting on his shoulders as he pulled it onto his head with dramatic flair. "Look at me. I'm one of you now." Boinko shouted at the top of his lungs, puffing out his chest like a peacock. He struck the most ridiculous pose he could manage, hands clasped behind his back arched as he tried to mimic the guard's posture. The crowd laughed, some in disbelief at how absurd he looked, while others couldn't help but cheer him on. But the hat, of course, wasn't having it. Every time Boinko tried to straighten up, the oversized hat would slip down over his eyes, blinding him. He had to shuffle back a step, and with a comic thud, he collided with a nearby mailbox, sending it rattling. The crowd burst into laughter, some wiping tears from their eyes as Boinko awkwardly tried to right himself. Boinko stumbled away from the mailbox, his hat slipping further down his face, but his spirit remained undeterred. He gave the crowd a sheepish wink. "Well, that's one way to blend in," he muttered, his voice tinged with embarrassment. Despite the crowd roaring with laughter, the royal guard still didn't move. The man's face remained as rigid as stone. How? How was he doing this? Boinko thought, a hint of desperation creeping in. All right, Boinko muttered to himself, scratching his head. "I'll take this up a notch." His eyes scanned the scene, and that's when he spotted it. A street performer who had just finished juggling colorful balls in front of a small crowd. Without hesitation, Boinko darted over and practically tackled the performer, charmingly asking, "Hey, mind if I borrow that?" The juggler, startled but amused, handed over a large inflatable sword with a dramatic flourish, clearly not expecting Boinko to use it in quite the way he intended. Boinko grabbed it with glee, swinging it around with an exaggerated swish as he marched back to face the unshakable guard. "This is it," Boinko announced to the crowd, brandishing the inflatable sword like a knight preparing for an epic duel. He swung it wildly over his head with all the flair of an overzealous pirate, shouting, "Challenge time! The ultimate showdown!" The crowd leaned in, holding their breath. Could this be the moment the guard would finally break? Boinko lunged toward the guard, raising the inflatable sword above his head with one hand and pointing at the guard's rifle with the other, as if issuing a challenge. "This is mine now!" he cried with mock grandeur, trying to tap the rifle with his plastic weapon. The tourists gasped and several cameras clicked. Surely the guard would react now. But again, the guard's posture didn't shift. Not even a hint of acknowledgement. His eyes remained locked forward, unfazed by the ridiculous antics unfolding just inches away. Frustration mounted in Boinko's chest. This was supposed to be the big moment, the one that would make the guard crack. But all he got in return was complete stillness. So, in a final burst of determination, Boinko took a swing with the inflatable sword, one too hard, one too dramatic. As his arm swung down, His oversized shoes slipped on the cobblestones, sending him careening forward. With a whoosh, Boinko lost his balance entirely and crashed directly into the guard's leg. The inflatable sword slipped from his hand and bounced comically off the ground. The crowd gasped in a collective ooh as Boinko's legs flailed in the air. He had somehow ended up tangled around the guard's legs, his body sprawled on the cobblestones in an awkward heap. For a split second, everything went silent. Then, from the pile of limbs and rubber, Boinko's head popped up, his face flushed red. He looked up at the guard, his eyes wide with surprise and embarrassment. Oops. Boinko chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his head as he tried to sit up. The crowd couldn't contain themselves. They erupted into laughter, some clutching their stomachs from the sheer absurdity of it all. Even a few tourists who'd been recording couldn't help but laugh out loud at the sight of Boinko tangled with the guard's immovable form. But once again, the guard did nothing, not even a glance. The royal guard stood there like a statue, unwavering, indifferent to Boinko's increasingly ridiculous antics. Boinko tried to get up, but his feet were tangled in the guard's boots. He gave one final attempt, slipped on the cobblestones, and landed back in the same awkward position, now upside down with his feet in the air. "Oh, come on! How is this even possible?" Boinko groaned, pushing himself up, still caught in the clutches of his own failed stunt. As the crowd continued to laugh, Boinko realized something. He had underestimated the power of stillness, of composure. But it didn't stop him from being determined. There had to be a way to crack this guard. There had to be. Boinko, his confidence at an all-time high and his patience at an all-time low, was determined to win this battle. The crowd was loving his antics, but he was growing increasingly desperate. The royal guard had remained as steadfast as ever, unflinching, unmoving, and completely unaffected by every prank Boinko had thrown his way. But Boinko was nothing if not persistent, and when the crowd is cheering you on, you find a way to deliver. This was it, his final attempt. He glanced around and saw a tourist nearby, clutching a megaphone, seemingly oblivious to the chaos unfolding around the royal guard. In an instant, Boinko snatched the megaphone, his oversized shoes clacking on the cobblestones as he whipped it from the tourist's hand, much to their surprise. "I've got just the thing to shake things up," he shouted, his voice booming through the megaphone. The crowd froze, anticipating what would happen next. Without missing a beat, Boinko pressed the button, and a loud, offbeat, marching band tune erupted from the speaker. The music was completely out of sync, a cacophony of brass and drums that sounded as though it had been composed by a wind-up toy with a broken spring. It was completely absurd. "Here comes the Royal Clown Band," Boinko announced theatrically, his voice deepening with mock grandeur as he stepped directly into the guard's line of sight. The crowd fell silent in anticipation, their eyes fixed on Boinko as he danced to the erratic rhythm, twirling and spinning as if he were conducting a parade. Boinko's arms flailed dramatically, one hand holding the megaphone and the other gesturing wildly like a conductor leading an orchestra of mayhem. He hopped from one foot to the other, his oversized shoes flapping with every exaggerated step. Twirl, step, jump. With each spin, he made exaggerated, goofy faces, sticking out his tongue, pulling his cheeks, and puffing them out like a pufferfish. He even added a few high kicks, clearly performing for the tourists who were in hysterics. And then he went for it. He sang. The tune was so off-pitch it could have shattered glass. "We are the royal clowns, and we have come to take over," he belted out, his voice cracking in all the wrong places. "Bwah!" He laughed maniacally, trying to imitate the sound of an evil overlord. The crowd roared with laughter, some clutching their stomachs, others gasping for air between fits of giggles. People were pulling out their phones, snapping videos, completely captivated by Boinko's relentless effort. Boinko's eyes glinted with excitement. "This is it! This has to do it!" For a brief moment, he thought he saw it. Just a flicker, a subtle shift in the royal guard's weight, a slight movement of his boot, or maybe it was the guard's eyes narrowing just a fraction. Was the guard about to crack? Was this finally the moment Boinko had been waiting for? Boinko leaned in closer, pressing the megaphone to his lips, nearly shouting into it, "You can't ignore me forever, Mr. Guard. Come on, just a little smile." The crowd held its breath, as if they too were waiting for the inevitable. There it was, the moment of victory, the moment when the guard's stoic exterior would crumble. But then the guard did something Boinko had never expected. Without a single change in his posture, without a twitch or a shift in his stern gaze, the royal guard did the unthinkable. He slowly raised his right hand. Boinko's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was he finally reacting? The guard's hand moved with precision, his fingers twitching ever so slightly. Boinko's eyes widened, his jaw dropping slightly. He had never seen such a precise movement, as though the guard was about to engage in a martial arts move or some form of tactical counterattack. Boinko held his breath. And then, in the most anticlimactic moment of all, the royal guard moved his hand to his mouth and made a small, barely audible cough. Boinko froze. His face fell. The crowd went dead silent, confused by the sudden break in the momentum. The silence was deafening. The guard had simply coughed. That was all. No dramatic gesture, no clap or smile, just a single, neutral cough. Boinko stood there, stunned. He had poured his heart and soul into this final performance, and all he got was a cough? The realization hit him like a bucket of cold water. The guard hadn't moved because of his ridiculous antics. He hadn't cracked because of Boinko's musical masterpiece. He hadn't even flinched. Boinko stood there, his megaphone still in hand, staring at the royal guard in disbelief. The crowd, too, seemed frozen in place, still processing what had just happened. For a long moment, everything was still. The only sound that could be heard was the faint echo of Boinko's laughter, now nervously fading into awkward silence. Finally, Boinko cleared his throat, his face reddening with embarrassment, but also a little admiration for the guard's iron will. "Well," he said, his voice trailing off in defeat, "I guess that's one way to handle things." With a sheepish smile, he lowered the megaphone and took a step back. The crowd, sensing the anticlimax, let out a mix of chuckles and applause. Some even clapped for Boinko's determination, while others awkwardly shifted in place, unsure of how to react to the unexpected turn of events. Boinko took a bow, raising his hands in mock surrender. I think it's time to call it a day," he said, his voice still carrying a note of humor, despite his obvious defeat. He gave the guard one last look of respect, if not a little embarrassment, and turned to exit the scene. But as he walked away, the crowd began to cheer. They weren't laughing at him anymore. They were cheering for him. They appreciated the clown's perseverance, the way he'd gone all in, no matter how ridiculous it got. Boinko smiled, still a bit flustered, but happy to have entertained the crowd, even if the guard remained an unshakable, unflappable force. As he left, he gave a playful wave to the guard. "Good job, Mr. Guard. You win this round, but I'll be back." And with that, Boinko disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a trail of laughter, applause, and the unmistakable echo of a single royal cough. The laughter from the crowd still lingered in the air as Boinko stepped back, his energy beginning to wane. He had given it everything, the pranks, the music, the oversized hats, each move more absurd than the last. And yet the royal guard stood before him like a rock, immovable and unyielding. Boinko had thought he was getting close, that maybe, just maybe, the guard would crack. But that last, brief cough was the final straw. And then something happened that Boinko never expected. With one smooth, deliberate motion, the royal guard took a step forward. The air around them seemed to shift, the crowd stilled. Boinko's heart skipped a beat as he watched the guard, whose posture had been so rigid and unbending, suddenly move, taking one step toward him. It wasn't a lunge, nor was it a quick movement. No, the guard's action was precise, controlled, like the calm before a storm. Boinko's grin faltered. He froze, suddenly aware of how close the guard was. The guard's eyes, though still locked forward, seemed to pierce straight through him. Every fiber of Boinko's body screamed for him to say something, to keep the prank going, but all that came out was a faint chuckle, barely audible. "That's enough, clown," the guard said, his voice low, firm, and filled with an authority that sent a shiver down Boinko's spine. The words hit him like a bucket of ice water. All the noise, all the laughter around him seemed to fade away. For the first time, Boinko was completely still, utterly stunned by the guard's presence. The tension in the air was palpable. He could hear his own breath, shallow and quick, as the reality of the situation settled in. The guard hadn't just been standing there. He had been watching, waiting, and now Boinko knew he had crossed a line. The crowd held its breath. Even the tourists, who had been enjoying Boinko's antics, felt the weight of the moment. Boinko's usual antics, his loud laughter, his wild movements, had faltered in the face of the guard's quiet authority. Caught off guard, Boinko took an awkward step back. The words he had ready seemed to vanish into thin air. He glanced around desperately for something to say, something to keep the joke alive. But the guard's presence was overwhelming. Boinko's legs felt unsteady, and he backed up a little too quickly, bumping into a nearby trash can. The can rattled loudly, making a comically discordant noise, but it only made Boinko's embarrassment more apparent. He tried to crack a smile, his usual confident grin, but it came out more like a nervous grimace. His shoulders slumped just a bit. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some still laughing, others now watching with curiosity as they waited for the next move. "Time to go, clown." The guard's voice cut through the silence, his words like a final, unmistakable command. Boinko's stomach twisted. The crowd's laughter quieted, giving way to a soft murmur of surprise. There was no playfulness in the guard's voice, no room for humor or games. This wasn't part of the joke anymore. The clown had been caught. As if on cue, the crowd erupted into applause. Boinko stood there, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to keep going, to pull another trick from his sleeve. But another part of him, perhaps the part that had just been humbled by the sheer force of the guard's command, knew it was over. Boinko took one final look at the guard. There was no anger in the man's eyes, no mockery, just a calm, unwavering authority. The clown nodded sheepishly, stepping back as if on autopilot. All right, Boinko muttered, his voice small in comparison to the cheers. "You win this round, Mr. Guard." With one last, half-hearted wave to the crowd, Boinko slowly backed away. The guard, of course, didn't move an inch, his stance as rigid and impenetrable as ever. As Boinko finally turned to leave, the applause from the crowd followed him, some cheering for his effort, others simply enjoying the spectacle of a clown outplayed by the very thing he had tried to disrupt. For Boinko, it was a humbling experience, but one he would surely laugh about later. After all, he was a clown. Even in defeat, there was humor to be found. Now fully humbled, Boinko stood motionless for a moment. His face was flushed, but the amusement hadn't completely left his eyes. He looked up at the crowd, still clapping and laughing, appreciating the wild ride they had just witnessed. He slowly reached up and removed the oversized Royal Guard hat, holding it in his hands like a trophy, albeit one that didn't quite suit him. The crowd's applause softened, but they were still smiling. Some had even stopped recording, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. With a sheepish grin, Boinko straightened up, puffing out his chest for one last dramatic bow. He exaggerated the motion, bending at the waist with all the flair of a Broadway performer. "Well, folks," Boinko began, his voice light and playful despite the situation, "looks like I lost this one." He held up his hands in mock defeat, his palms out in the universal gesture of surrender. The crowd erupted into more laughter, some even cheering for his good-natured spirit. "But hey," he added with a wink, "you can't win them all, right?" His voice carried the same self-assured tone, even though his antics had been outdone by the guard's stoic resolve. He turned to the Royal Guard, his expression softening as he gave the man a nod of respect, this time with no more pranks, just acknowledgement. The guard didn't speak, but his stoic expression softened ever so slightly. For the first time in the entire exchange, the smallest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It was almost imperceptible, but to Boinko it was the most genuine gesture of the whole interaction. It was as if the guard, while unmoved by his antics, had at least recognized the clown's perseverance. Boinko felt a surge of unexpected respect for the guard in return. He nodded once more, this time with a sincere smile of his own. "You've got me, Mr. Guard. Well played," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Then, with a dramatic flair, Boinko straightened his shoulders and turned on his heel, ready to exit the scene. He walked away slowly, still chuckling to himself, his oversized shoes tapping along the cobblestones with a rhythm of their own. As he passed by the crowd, he gave a cheeky wink to the nearest camera or onlooker, as if to remind them that, despite everything, he was still the clown. "Guess I'll stick to juggling next time," Boinko called out, his voice ringing with a playful tone. His words were met with another round of laughter and a few more claps from the audience, appreciating his humor even in defeat. They had been entertained, and Boinko had certainly given them a show, even if the ending hadn't quite gone the way he had expected. The sound of the crowd's laughter faded behind him as he made his way off the scene. Boinko, humbled but still with his trademark humor intact, walked off into the distance, his shoulders slightly slumped, but his grin never quite fading. The royal guard, of course, remained in place, his expression as calm and steady as ever, never once shifting. He was still the silent sentinel, unbreakable in his discipline. But for Boinko, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the journey, the laughs, and the simple joy of trying. He'd come to entertain, and even if he hadn't succeeded in pranking the guard, he had definitely given the crowd something to remember. Well, what do you think? Who do you think took this round? Boinko or the Royal Guard? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, let us know where you're watching from. Did the clown finally meet his match, or does Boinko get another shot next time? Let's hear it.